In the heart of New Haven, Yale is one of the city's oldest institutions and one of the largest, with more than 20,000 students, faculty, and staff, and its own police force. But the mysterious and troubling disappearance of doctoral student Annie Lee, with intensive media coverage of the investigation, is most unwelcome publicity. Today, authorities continue to work in the laboratory where Annie Lee was last seen. Authorities reportedly have discovered bloody clothing in the ceiling of the building. Published reports say the clothing is not Lee's. Investigators are also poring through garbage at a Hartford waste facility looking for clues.
In the late evening hours of September 8, 2009, the FBI office in New Haven, Connecticut, received a call from the local police department requesting assistance on a case they believed was extremely time-sensitive. Earlier that evening, a woman called the police to report that her roommate hadn't returned home and wasn't responding to calls or texts from anyone. Normally, police would wait 24 hours before investigating a missing persons case, but this one was different. The reason this case was especially concerning was that the missing person, 24-year-old Yale student Annie Lee, was known to be very responsive in her communications, especially now, since her wedding was scheduled in just 5 days. She'd been in constant contact with almost everyone she knew to make the final arrangements for her wedding ceremony, and out of nowhere, she suddenly went radio silent. Police immediately sprung into action and started gathering as much information as they could. They learned that Annie was born to a Vietnamese family in San Jose, California, and spent her childhood with her aunt and uncle. As a child, she stood out as a very smart student, and her teachers all knew she had a bright future ahead of her. By the end of high school, Annie was made valedictorian of her graduating class and was voted most likely to be the next Einstein. Annie was also very ambitious. After graduating college with a degree in biology, she was accepted into a graduate program at the prestigious Yale University, which would have led her to earn her doctorate in pharmacology. Annie was driven by a strong desire to discover a cure for cancer and focused her research on experimental cancer treatments. The first person police looked at as a possible suspect was her fiance, 24-year-old Jonathan Wadowski. Jonathan was finishing up a doctoral degree of his own at Columbia University in the neighboring state of New York. Police called him and asked him to come in to speak with them in person, but he said that he was at home in Long Island and would try to make it up to Connecticut as soon as he could. But Jonathan did provide some information over the phone. Police had suspected that Annie may have had cold feet from her upcoming wedding and asked him what he thought. Jonathan was adamant that despite being a little nervous, he and Annie were both very excited about their wedding and that she'd never just up and leave like that. Annie's friends and family told officers the same thing. In fact, everyone who was questioned said that it was not at all like her to stop responding, and they were all worried that something may have happened to her. By the following morning, FBI agents were sent to Yale University, where Annie was last seen, and started gathering information from her co-workers. Her colleagues said that she arrived at her office in the morning and stayed at her desk for a while, then left for the research lab to start an experiment, and hasn't been seen or heard from since. Investigators went over to Annie's office and started looking around for clues. They found her phone and her purse with her keys, her ID, and all her credit cards still inside. But there was no sign of a struggle. Investigators left Annie's office in Sterling Hall and followed the route she would have taken to her laboratory, which was about a 5-minute walk down the street. The lab is located in the basement of the Animal Research Facility, where all the animal testing is conducted. As soon as investigators walk through the doors, they're hit with a strong odor of animal waste. The layout of the lab is complex, almost like a maze, with rooms leading into other rooms and industrial equipment everywhere. They make their way down several corridors and finally get to room G13, where Annie was supposed to be conducting her experiments. The first thing they notice as they walk in is that the other side of the room can't be seen from the door because of how the racks were placed. They briefly looked around the room, but nothing of interest stood out, and they left empty-handed. With no leads to follow, campus police and the FBI called in reinforcements from Connecticut State Police and reached out to the public for help. Missing flyers were handed out and plastered all around the neighborhood, while local news stations alerted viewers about Anna's disappearance. While at the lab, investigators noticed that each lab worker carried around a key card, which they had to use to get through each door in the building. They reached out to campus security and requested the activity logs to find out where everyone was when Annie went missing. While waiting for the keycard access data, FBI agents spotted CCTV cameras in and around the research facility. Within 24 hours of Annie's disappearance, investigators had the security footage and started combing through it. The first thing they need to figure out is whether or not Annie made it to the lab. There are 2 cameras installed outside of the building. One of them overlooks the main entrance, and the other one covers the side door. At 10:09 a.m., Annie can be seen approaching the main entrance and walking into the building. Her demeanor appears to be normal, and she doesn't seem to be upset or worried about anything. They switch to the interior of the building, hoping to establish a timeline of Annie's whereabouts throughout the day, but there's only one camera in the basement level that covers a hallway near G13, where Annie conducts her experiments. They scrub through the footage, but she doesn't appear on camera that whole day. A team of investigators spent the rest of the night combing through footage from the rest of the building, but she doesn't appear in any of those either. It's been over 24 hours since anyone's heard from Annie, and law enforcement still haven't found a clue as to what may have happened to her. They shifted their focus to the exterior of the building and scoured the CCTV footage throughout the whole day to make sure she hadn't slipped out. By the time they reach 12:50 p.m., a swarm of people suddenly start pouring out of both exits, with many of them covering their ears. It looks like a fire alarm went off. Everyone in the building knows to evacuate, so Annie should be captured leaving. Detectives went through the footage frame by frame, ruling out each and every person who walked out, but Annie never appears. The whole building was thoroughly searched, but there was no sign of her anywhere. This was not a good sign, and law enforcement now need to consider some sinister possibilities. If Annie never walked out of the building, then she was probably taken out of it a different way. Annie had a small stature, standing at less than 5 feet tall, so she might have been carried out in a container of some sort. Investigators looked through the footage to see if anyone was carrying something big enough to hold her inside, but found nothing. This leaves only one possibility that detectives could think of. If Annie is not in the building and didn't leave through the doors, the only way she could have left was with the trash. This wouldn't have been hard to pull off, since the trash at the research facility leaves in very large batches and is often filled with animal waste and carcasses. All the bins that left the building were traced to a dump site in Hartford, and a search team was assembled and sent to look through all of it. They carefully opened and searched each bag, but couldn't find anything. It was almost as if Annie had walked into the building that morning and just vanished. Back at the station, Annie's fiance, Jonathan, finally arrives from New York 3 days after she went missing, and investigators are eager to question him. In cases of foul play, the perpetrator is often the person closest to the victim, and police need to rule him out. Jonathan tells police that he was at home in Long Island when Annie went missing and has no idea where she went or what happened to her. His demeanor seems normal, but officers were sent to New York to confirm his alibi and make sure. While waiting for confirmation, detectives received the access logs from the lab, which should show them the names of each person who used their keycards to enter each room, and the exact times. The logs indicate that Annie entered her lab in room G13 at 10:11 that morning, 2 minutes after she walked into the building, but her keycard hasn't been used since. This leads police to believe that something probably happened in room G13. They went back to the lab to conduct a second, more thorough search of Annie's room and made an ominous discovery. Above one of the ceiling panels, they found one discarded latex glove and a white sock, both with traces of blood on them. Police loaded up the footage once again, and sure enough, they find Annie wearing white ankle socks, just like the one they found. This all but confirms everyone's worst fears. Detectives urgently need to find out what happened to Annie and who did it. They go back to the access logs to find out who else was in G13 that day and identify 2 people. The first of them to be interviewed was a 24-year-old lab technician by the name of Raymond Clark. He tells detectives that he arrived at the lab at 7 a.m. and went to room G13 at around 10:30, where he saw Annie walking out. He says that when the fire alarm went off, he left the building and came back 10 minutes later, but didn't see Annie. Then he left work for the day at around 4 p.m. After collecting a DNA sample from him, police pulled up the footage to corroborate Raymond's account. Just a few minutes past 7 that morning, Raymond can be seen walking into the building. By the time the fire alarm goes off at around 1, he exits the building through the side door. He acts normal and walks out just like everyone else, holding the door for people behind him. About 10 minutes later, he can be seen walking back into the building through the main entrance. The next time he appears on camera is at around 4 p.m. when he leaves work for the day. So far, this corroborates everything Raymond told police. Detectives shift their attention to the other person who entered room G13, a man by the name of Larry Godfrey. Larry was a temporary worker who did repairs. He tells detectives that he arrived at work at around 11:30 that morning and briefly stopped by Annie's lab to change some lighting. He says that he evacuated the building through the side exit, came back to work a few minutes later, and then went home at around 2:30 p.m. The CCTV footage confirms this, and his behavior seems normal. Both of the men's stories check out, but it still isn't clear what they did inside the lab. With no prime suspect having been identified, police sent in a forensics team and expanded the search to the entire basement floor of the research facility. Just down the hall from Annie's lab is room G22. On the floor of that room, they found little beads that looked like they belonged on a necklace. Annie was wearing a beaded necklace when she was last seen. Following this tiny lead, police applied luminol to the walls and the floor of the entire room, and a gruesome crime scene started to emerge. Large amounts of blood left traces all across the floor and on the walls. Something sinister happened in this room, but Annie was still nowhere to be found. Police moved to the locker room in G30, which was just outside of G22. As soon as they enter, they smell a very distinct pungent odor that they know all too well: human decomposition. They know that Annie has got to be in here somewhere and bring in cadaver dogs. The dogs alert to a wall where there was a panel installed for access to plumbing. When police open up the panel, the odor becomes overwhelming. On the day that her wedding was supposed to take place, Annie's body was found decomposing inside of the wall. The search for Annie was over, and police now have a homicide case to investigate. Annie's body was carefully removed and sent for an autopsy. Around her neck was a broken necklace. The beads were identical to the ones found in room G22. Her underwear was pulled down to her knees, indicating that a sexual assault had taken place. There were multiple signs of trauma all over her body, including a broken jawbone and a broken clavicle. Her cause of death was ruled a homicide by asphyxiation. Annie was strangled to death. She also had on a single disposable glove and a single sock, which matched the ones found hidden above the ceiling panels in her lab. It's now clear that someone with access to the floor was hiding evidence. As the search continued, police found a disposable yellow lab coat with blood on it. But out of all the evidence they found, one thing in particular stood out. It was a green pen with green ink. Police went back to the keycard access logs to see who entered rooms G22 and G30 and found some unusual activity. On the day Annie went missing, one person entered room G22 11 times within a short period. It was the 24-year-old lab technician, Raymond Clark. Police got their hands on the logbooks and found that each time Raymond signed his name, he used a green pen, just like the one found in the wall with Annie's body. But after 1:30 p.m., his signatures are no longer signed in green ink. The evidence strongly suggests that Raymond was the one who murdered Annie, but police wanted more evidence before they made an arrest. They went back to the footage and found him wearing a disposable yellow lab coat over his scrubs, the same type as the one found with blood on it. By 10 a.m. later that same day, he was captured on camera leaving the building, then returning 20 minutes later. The next time he appears on camera is when he evacuated the building during the fire alarm. When he returns to the building a few minutes later, detectives notice that something looks different. The first time he left the building, he had on scrubs with red drawstrings on the pants. But when he came back after the fire alarm, it's clear that he changed into scrubs with blue drawstrings. It wasn't long before the DNA results came in and confirmed all suspicions. DNA from both Annie and Raymond Clark were found on the green pen. The blood on the lab coat, the sock, and the glove all belonged to Annie, and they all contained Raymond's DNA. On September 18, 2009, Raymond Clark was tracked down to a motel with his father and was arrested for the murder of Annie Lee. This news grabbed national attention, and people wanted to know what compelled Raymond to murder Annie in the middle of a work shift. Based on evidence that was later found, police came up with a possible theory. On the morning of September 8th, Annie went to her office at Sterling Hall to send out a few emails before heading to her lab. One of those emails was sent to everyone she worked with, including Raymond, informing them that she was getting married that Sunday and that she'd be out of work for a few days during her honeymoon the following week. Not too long after she sent the email, Annie received a text message from Raymond. As a technician at the animal lab, his duties included keeping the floors and the animal cages clean, and he asked to speak with her in person about the cleanliness of her mouse cages. At around 10 a.m., Annie left her office in Sterling Hall and walked to her lab down the street, where she arrived just a few minutes later. Police believe that Raymond likely had some type of obsession with Annie, and that when he found out she was getting married, he threw a fit of rage. By 10:35, he returned to the building from his break, and then put on a disposable lab coat. When he knew that nobody was around, Raymond went to Annie's lab in room G13 to confront her, and ended up strangling her to death, breaking her jawbone and her clavicle in the process. It's believed that as soon as he let go of her, he realized what he'd just done and started to panic. He knew he couldn't keep her in the lab, so he dragged her body to room G22 and then started to hide the evidence, leaving behind his bloody fingerprints by the ceiling panel. As he tried to figure out what he was going to do with the body, the fire alarm went off. He threw his bloody lab coat in a trash bin, then evacuated the building along with everyone else. He came back to the building 10 minutes later with new scrubs on and had to figure out what to do with Annie's body. He decided to drag her into the locker room, where he stuffed her into the wall along with his green pen, then cleaned up all the blood he left behind. Raymond never revealed his motive behind the murder, but ended up cutting a deal with prosecutors. In exchange for pleading guilty to the murder, he was handed a sentence of 44 years in prison. Raymond Clark is currently housed in Cheshire Correctional Institution in Connecticut and won't be released before 2053 when he's 68 years old.